Few of the blunders of World War II were as great as Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The attack brought the United States into the war. It lasted just under 2 hours, though most of the damage was inflicted in the first 30 minutes. When it was over, more than 2,300 military and civilian personnel were dead. Another 1,000 were wounded. When news of the attack reached the mainland, people were initially stunned. But as the enormity of what happened sank in, there was a great general outcry for revenge. America mobilized for war. Four and a half years later, atom bombs exploded over the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with appalling consequences. Japan was forced to surrender on August 14, 1945. The people of Japan ultimately paid a terrible price for the ambitions and complacency of their military leaders. Many traced the blame back to the fateful attack on Pearl Harbor. By bringing the United States into the war, Japan ensured its own total and humiliating defeat. But the Japanese blunder in attacking Pearl Harbor was compounded by mistakes in the planning and conduct of the attack. By December 1941, the war in Europe had been raging for 2 years. Under the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941, the United States was giving the Allies the munitions and raw materials they needed, but the U.S. refused to intervene militarily. After the horrors of World War I, Americans were reluctant to be pulled into another global conflict. Meanwhile, Japan had become a major power. During the 1930s, it had extended its influence throughout the Far East, seizing much of northern and central China and dominating large parts of Southeast Asia. Japan wanted to expand its territory for 2 reasons. First, Japan had experienced a population explosion. Second, Japan was extremely short of raw materials, especially oil, which was necessary to support their industrial growth. Matters grew worse during a world economic slump at the end of the 1920s, which hit Japan particularly hard. In 1931, Japan forcibly annexed Manchuria. Six years later, Japan invaded China. As a result, the U.S. began to give financial aid to China with the support and encouragement of Great Britain. This did not deter Japanese aggression. Japan retaliated by attacking American and British ships. It even sank the gunboat USS Panay in Chinese waters off Shanghai. President Roosevelt was appalled and wanted to mount an immediate naval blockade against Japan. He backed off when Britain failed to support him. Japan was so dependent on U.S. oil imports that it eventually apologized for attacking the Panay. Without oil from abroad, Japan's military ambitions would have soon ground to a halt. In mid-1941, the country only had enough oil for the next 18 months. Admiral Nagano, chief of Japan's naval staff, realized his country's critical situation. He told Emperor Hirohito that Japan was like a fish in a pond that was gradually being drained. Japan needed to become self-sufficient in raw materials. To do so, it needed an overseas empire. The Japanese High Command drew up an ambitious war plan. It included capturing Thailand, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. In the meantime, Japanese aggression against China continued, despite protests from the US and Great Britain. Eventually, President Roosevelt felt he had no choice but to freeze Japan's assets in the United States, and more importantly, to cut off its oil supply. Admiral Nomura, Japan's ambassador to Washington, warned his government that the United States was serious and that Japan should make concessions, but the Japanese leadership was about to commit a grave error. Japanese Prime Minister Prince Konoye was worried by President Roosevelt's decision to freeze Japan's assets in the US. He argued that Japan should be prepared to make concessions over China. Members of his cabinet opposed him. On October 17, 1941, he was replaced by the aggressive war minister, General Hideki Tojo. Tojo was determined to build Japan's new empire, but he was fully aware that the powerful U.S. Pacific Fleet was a major obstacle. Japan's military leaders and strategists had been plotting a strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet as early as December 1940. The chief architect of the final plan was Admiral Ishiroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto believed in the power of the aircraft carrier. In particular, he was inspired by the successful British carrier attack on the Italian fleet base at Taranto, which sank 3 battleships. He developed a similar attack plan on the main U.S. Pacific Fleet base in the Hawaiian Islands, Pearl Harbor. But Yamamoto recognized that America was a dangerous enemy. He had spent time in the U.S. during the 1920s and knew that its industrial base would give America a powerful edge in war. Still, he thought it would take the U.S. at least 6 months to rebuild its Pacific Fleet. By that time, Yamamoto hoped Japan would have consolidated its overseas empire. The United States, he thought, would then find the cost of driving Japan back too high. After heated discussion, the Japanese High Command allowed Yamamoto to proceed. On November 26, 1941, the United States told Japan to withdraw her troops from China. There was no response. This was hardly surprising. The Japanese fleet, maintaining complete radio silence, had set sail for Hawaii 4 days earlier. The fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. It consisted of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and some 430 attack aircraft. In addition, 27 Japanese submarines were deployed near the entrance of Pearl Harbor itself. 5 of these carried midget submarines. U.S. intelligence had assumed for some time that an attack was imminent. In fact, U.S. codebreakers had been deciphering top-secret messages to the Japanese embassy in Washington for several months. The U.S. knew Japan was ready to strike somewhere in the Pacific. But where? Early warnings had been sent to various outlying military commands, including Hawaii, where approximately 100 vessels, just under half the U.S. Pacific Fleet, were at anchor in the harbor.